Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Inept General coming to you with another Bretonnian Dukedom video, and this is one of an ongoing series where we look at all the individual dukedoms of Bretonnia and give you a bit of lore and history about each and every one of them. Today we are going to be talking about the magical beachside dukedom of Aquitaine. Now, Aquitaine in the game is really just a subsidiary of Bordelot, but in its own right, it is a dukedom, and you know what, a very nice beachfront dukedom at that. So let's go through a little bit of history of this beachfront property that is Aquitaine. So Aquitaine, like the rest of Bretonnia, was founded in a similar way, peopled by the Bretonnian tribe, which were the people who first came across the Grey Mountains and settled in the lands that would one day become known as Bretonnia. They split up, had inner conflicts, and divvied up sort of little kingdoms, each to themselves. Aquitaine was one of them. Now, at the time, without being united, all of these different sort of what would become the dukedoms were fighting amongst each other, but then bigger threats came along, beastmen, greenskins, and towards the year 977 of the imperial calendar, so about 1,500 years before the Total War Warhammer timeline, really stuff starts to go very badly. All of these forces against humans are getting together and look to be about to wipe out the entirety of the Bretonnian tribe, all the different kingdoms they've set up in these lands, about to be completely wiped off the face of the map. And that is when the great unifier, Gilles le Breton, arrives on the scene, blessed by the Lady of the Lake. He takes his new super-powered Grail Knights, and they begin a fight across Bretonnia to go and liberate and unify it as one single kingdom. Now, around this time, the leader of what would become the Dukedom of Aquitaine was a man known as Fredimund of Aquitaine. Now, he was leading his people, but he was under siege like the rest of Bretonnia and really couldn't fight his way out until he was liberated by the army of Gilles le Breton. Upon freeing him and sort of getting his forces to join theirs, they made Fredimund the fifth Grail companion, so the fifth ever Grail Knight ever in Bretonnia. He drank from the Grail presented to him by the lady and became a super-powered knight in his own right and went on to fight many battles, perhaps distinguishing himself the most at the Siege of Brion, where they were fighting against a huge army of greenskins, and Fredimund managed to bring his ancient family horn and blew it, which had the ability to summon a whole flock of falcons, although I'm not sure if that's the multiple word for falcons, and they started to peck at the eyes of the wyverns carrying all the war bosses flying over the battlefield, peck at their wings, render them into a bloody mess, and they fell down to the ground to be slaughtered by the Bretonnian forces below, thus winning the battle. Leaderless, the greenskins eventually broke. Now, the whole campaign raged about 12 battles, if I remember correctly. If you'd like to know a bit more about the full campaign to liberate Bretonnia, do check out my Green Knight video popping up in the top right hand corner, because the Green Knight is in fact the resurrected soul stroke ghost of Gilles le Breton. So do check that out, guys. That will go through the battles in a bit more detail and tell you about the campaign. And in fact, Fredimund of Aquitaine went on to marry Gilles le Breton's younger sister. Gilles, of course, was made the first king of Bretonnia, and Fredimund the first Duke of Aquitaine. And then history marches on. Now, Aquitaine in itself is not the center of any huge events. A lot of stuff happens. It goes through many things like the Red Pox that swept over Bretonnia. It goes through the major tribulations that affects Bretonnia as a whole, but really as far as its specific history is concerned, not a lot sort of huge note happens until around, I think, the year 1450 in my opinion. Now, this is still about 1,000 years before the start of the Total War Warhammer timeline, and this is the rise of the Duke of Aquitaine, who would go on to become known as El Sith, and as we who play the Total War Warhammer game might know him better as the Red Duke. In fact, he is not a Duke of Mousillon, he never was. He was an ancient Duke of Aquitaine, and this is where the Red Duke actually comes from. He went to go on the Crusades. A lot of very bad things happened to him. He gets turned into a vampire. I'm not going to go into all the details in this video, guys, because I feel we've covered that already in a separate video I've done concerning the Red Duke. Again, do check that out in the top right-hand corner now, or you'll find the link in the description below if you're interested in seeing a bit more about his story. Dastardly sad tale of madness and patricide-ish, kind of. I don't know. I'll let you take your opinion on it when you hear the story, but do check that out. And really, that's sort of it. Takes us up to modern-day Aquitaine in terms of all the histories. Now, the province itself, as far as its geography is concerned, is really a nice kind of geographical place, at least. Not a lot of woodland. It's got the gentlest coastline in the whole of Bretonnia, with a lot of beaches and safe coves for ships to make harbour. Not a lot of huge weather affects it badly. It's almost all arable land. It has no real major rivers running through it, and no huge, geographical markers like mountains or anything like that. This makes it great for farming, but terrible for defending yourself. There's not a lot of natural defences that you can build around, so really when there's trouble, everyone has to sort of run to the nearest castle. It's the only defence they possibly have. No natural boundaries or borders. It's kind of just a big open plain that leads into a nice, gentle beach. You know, kind of nice place to live if you weren't surrounded by monsters all the time. Although it has to be said that due to the lack of sort of dense forests or anything like that, they're not as beset as some of the other dukedoms by monsters or greenskins coming down from mountains, although they do have their fair share of troubles. Now, an odd feature about the Dukedom of Aquitaine is that because of this indefensible position, a lot of towns are kind of left behind sometimes, completely ravaged and then never rebuilt, or a lot of the way they build their cities, they kind of shift it around for some reason, which leads to a lot of abandoned buildings and a lot of towns. This has led to a strange creature becoming particularly, I wouldn't say common, but more manifest than perhaps in the rest of the Warhammer world, and that is the creature of the derelicts. Dereliches? It's meant to sound like derelicts, but I'm not sure how you're meant to say it. Dereliches. Let's say that. So these things, not people, these things are kind of monsters that live in abandoned castles or abandoned houses, and they're very kind of territorial. They'll only take one house, and very rarely they'll live in the same castle or anything. But if the place is big enough, they'll share a wing with another one of the creatures, and they have illusionary powers. They're able to make a house look warm and inviting and nice, and allow people to settle down when really it's a horrible place and you're being fed maggot bread. And they will then just kill you in your sleep or something equally horrendous. But these things are relatively commonplace in Aquitaine just to the sheer amount of abandoned towns and buildings around the place. So something to watch out for if one ever travels the dukedom. Now, as far as the people of this wonderful province are concerned, because there's no huge overall armies of beastmen and stuff, they tend not to really bind together as some other dukedoms have, and often there is a lot of squabbling amongst people of Aquitaine. They'll fight each other, there'll be village spats, there'll be family spats within villages, there'll be spats in families, a lot of fighting, and they tend to solve their problems through conflict rather than any other discussion or anything like that. So, you know, quick to violence, but, you know, they're sort of, I'll punch you in the face and that's the discussion done, let me help you up until our next argument. And this happens so often because really the people of Aquitaine are just all pretty stubborn. As a generalization, they're just a stubborn folk who, as I said, are quick to violence. Now, they would describe themselves as being, you know, people who take pride in honor and courage and their convictions rather than, you know, prone to violence and stubborn as hell. Now, this fighting isn't just amongst the common folk, it's very much amongst the nobility of Aquitaine as well, which leads to many nobles being kind of exiled or having to leave due to some offense they've caused or some fight they've been in. And so there's a lot of exiled Aquitaine nobles who have just sort of left the province due to one or other of these squabbles stroke feuds that are ongoing. Now, two of the biggest ones of note in the dukedom at the moment are between two nobles, one known as Delbic and Dumazen, and this is over who soiled whose daughter, and they've actually, kind of forgotten about who did what to who. The fight's been going on for so many years, but this has led to a number of very organized battles that happen, once a week every Thursday or something along those lines, and it's so scheduled that they'll often get a little crowd to each one of these battles between the two clans, and people kind of it's very formalized, almost like a sport. People sit around, watch, get the binoculars out. Oh, it's time for the bi-monthly battle of these two families. Let's go have a watch. What else are you going to do this Sunday? So that's what's going on with them. And towards the west side of the dukedom, there is the Earl of Derodus and the Earl of Flucicé, I think is how you say their name. And they're sort of ex-best friends, and they fight amongst themselves as well. So really a couple of major quarrels going on, but there are always quarrels going on in the dukedom of Aquitaine. Now, in terms of relevant places, probably the most important we'll start with today is the city of Aquitaine itself. The capital is half abandoned, and because they're kind of building newly, as I mentioned earlier, the Aquitanians like to build, so they built their city, and it kind of seems to be shifting from east to west, as more houses are abandoned and more built in newer areas, rather than tearing them down or renovating them or anything like that. They just kind of build around it. So you do have these derelictions sort of moving in, and you do have the town moving around. Now, the most notable building in Aquitaine itself is the Tower of Lace, a tower with so many windows that it seems truly structurally unsound. You can almost see through it. Dwarves who have gone around the city be like, that is going to collapse and kill a lot of people. But you know what? It stood for over 100 years at this point. However, it must be said that there are very strict rules in Aquitaine. No one's allowed to lean against the building. Almost you're not allowed to look at it too hard. That's not really a rule, but you get the idea. It seems like you might think that's because they hold it in reverence, but it equally might be because they fear if you lean on the building, it will bloody collapse. So that is what's going on with this huge tower of many windows in the middle of the city that is barely hanging on, and no one's been allowed in for the last 50 years. So it has stood on 100 years, barely, and even the Duke's daughter leant on it once, and she was given 10 lashes for doing so. So no one is exempt from the rules of don't touch the glass tower, please. That's ours. That might go terribly wrong. Moving away from the capital of the dukedom, we go to Chateau Épée, which is a large fortress built by the current Lord Épée's great-grandfather, who was a renowned adventurer and managed to amass a huge amount of wealth by collecting treasures from around the Warhammer world. Now, he started to build fortifications which generation upon generation have continued to build, leading almost to a labyrinthine fortification where you'd be hard-pressed to find the central keep of the entire complex. Now, it's said that this complex has become so complicated and the family for generations have been driven to such madness that they've continued building upon building upon building, that no one has returned alive for 10 years from the central keep of this complex. The current Lord Épée lives on one of the outer walls of the fortification itself, and he was the last person to arrive, and although no one's come back alive for 10 years, no one's come back sane for 15, and he was the last one to enter 10 years ago, and came back a raving loon. Now, what magical entities, items are in this labyrinthine fortification that have caused such madness? Are they worth pursuing by local adventurers? Who knows? Many have tried, few have returned. So that is one of the oddities about this heavily fortified castle that is of little use to anyone, known as Chateau Épée. Now, the next place we're going to look at is Derden-Libre. Now, this is a village run by peasants. Now, you and I both know this would be completely unacceptable to Bretonnians, but at the current moment in time, the idea is that the local nobility are fighting amongst each other or fighting external threats to have really turned their full focus on this minor, as far as they're concerned, peasant uprising that has taken hold of an entire village. The idea that the last lord of this village was completely repulsive and he sort of tortured peasants, beat them more than the regular lord would, and this caused a peasant uprising. Now, normally another lord would have immediately come in, killed all the peasants, upstarts, and then just taken over the village. However, there's no clear claim on the village, and so the lords who would want to take it over are busy fighting amongst themselves and are too busy to put down this peasant uprising going on in Aquitaine. Now, for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar, the idea of the peasantry rising up in Bretonnia is just the worst idea imaginable. My God, no lord could be forgiven for having a peasant uprising in his dukedom. This is a stain on one's honor and one's family. But this is what's going on in Aquitaine at the moment. The peasants are having time to consolidate their power, they have fought a couple of skirmishes. One major one, led by noble cavalry, was leading in, about to charge into the village, but because they'd had so much time to prepare and the lords had fought against themselves so much, they'd managed to dig pit traps around the battlefield, and many cavalrymen fell into these pits, skewering themselves on the wooden stakes below, causing a first victory for this peasant uprising. Now, we have to imagine that no lord will have this uprising going on in the province for long, but at the moment it's said that it is still ongoing, but however, there are whispers of cultists in the area, perhaps being tied into the idea of the leadership of this peasant uprising. Cultists of Khorne or of Nurgle have been spotted around, so beware that this may not be the peasant uprising with the noblest of intentions, and is more than likely going to lead into a slaughter of all of the peasants involved eventually. So moving on from the places around the dukedom that might be a particular note, let's have a look at the big guy himself, the current Duke of Aquitaine, Duke Armand. Now, Duke Armand was a young knight-errant, known as being reckless at the time in his younger years, but, a fierce fighter, and he was, in fact, offered a place in the royal household by the King of Bretonnia, of course, Louis Leoncoeur. Now, Louis saw his skill, but he was also the youngest son at the time, and so there was no real chance of him taking over anything, so a chance to be in the Royal Knights was a chance he couldn't pass up, so he went to join and spent a lot of time in the capital with the king. Now, over many battles, he completely distinguished himself in the king's eyes, in the eyes of his fellow knights, proving himself hugely valorous, and perhaps most noticeably slaying the beast lord called Dormal, the Crooked Bestigor, in single combat to the amazement of many of his fellow knights. Now, once he moved on from his knight-errant stage and became a knight of the realm, he was kind of being lined up for a nice cushy seat. He couldn't take over his family's dukedom, of course, being a younger son, but something like a small barony somewhere being set up for him with a bit of land, and he could live in the life of luxury. But he didn't do this. He didn't want to do this once he became a knight of the realm. It's like, no, I'm not going to rest on my laurels, and immediately went out to become a questing knight. Now, for those of you who aren't perhaps familiar with the Bretonnian knight sort of schedule of life, let's say, you start off as a young knight-errant, you go on to become a knight of the realm. That's just you, a full knight of Bretonnia. You don't need to go much further. But if you want to become a Grail Knight, you have to go on your quest for the Holy Grail, prove yourself worthy, and then maybe if you are, the Lady of the Lake will appear to you, offer you to drink from the Grail, at which point you become a Grail Knight. So he wasn't going to rest on his laurels, and he went out on his quest for the Grail immediately, trying to do valorous acts, setting around the land, helping out where he could. And lo and behold, this noble and valorous knight soon returned, a full-bore Grail Knight, having drunk from the Grail, dueled with the Green Knight, as all Grail Knights must. He proved himself worthy, and indeed became a pretty young, relatively, Grail Knight. Now, it's a bit of a mystery what happened to him during his questing time. He's never spoken about it with anybody. So we have to imagine something horrific, or maybe he's just that humble that he doesn't really want to speak about it. But just the fact that he doesn't mention it, it's a little bit strange in Bretonnian knightly circles. Soon after returning from his quest, he actually went on to win the tourney of Couronne in the capital of Bretonnia. Now, this was proving himself one of the best warriors in the entire kingdom, and as a result, he was awarded to become the banner bearer of Bretonnia itself. He'd ride into battle with the king, holding the banner of Bretonnia, the banner of the Lady of the Lake herself, the first one she gave to Gilles le Breton, riding that into battle for the king, Louis Leoncoeur, and becoming really a huge symbol of what a knight should aspire to be in Bretonnian society. Now, while he was the bannerman of Bretonnia, he would guard this banner fiercely. He would leave the banner to rest in the Grail Chapel. He wouldn't go to sleep on a bed. He'd sleep in the doorway of the Grail Chapel in Couronne, so no one could steal the banner. He guarded it with his life, and he took his duty seriously, really living up to this truly exemplary nature that he'd defined himself as ever really since he became a knight in the royal court. Eventually, however, he got word that his father died, and by this time, as he'd gone on from a knight-errant to a knight of the realm, to a questing knight, to a knight of the Grail, and the bannerman of the entirety of Bretonnia, his father had died, and so had 4 of his elder brothers. Now, one had died of plague, one of an overdose, one of some warpstone poisoning, and the other wasn't dead, actually. I take that back. He wasn't dead, but he was considered feeble-minded and was kind of locked away in a sanctuary somewhere. So he was kind of off the table. So there was no one else, and it took Louis Leonca himself appealing to Armand to take up his place as the Duke of Aquitaine, that the bannerman eventually conceded and agreed to take up his dukedom, although it must be said slightly reluctantly. Now, as far as his time as a bannerman, a lot's sort of known about Armand. He did have a sort of skill set as a bannerman once upon a time in the game of Warhammer, but really there's not a lot, there's not really a specific character put together as him as the Duke itself on the tabletop. But we can do things like there was a magical item in the Bretonnian army book known, I think, as the Horn of Aquitaine, or something along the lines of the Falcon Horn, which was the horn that his ancestor Fredimund had that summoned the falcons to fight the wyverns. Now, it's not specifically said that this is his item as such, rather that it is an item that can be put on troops in the Bretonnian army in the Warhammer army building list. But I like to think that, you know, when they're not using it, when he's not borrowing out to one of his mates, he has it back at the family home. So he has this falcon horn that was used by his ancestor. He probably still rides on a horse. He's not the bannerman anymore, as he's the Duke. So it's a bit up in the air, and there's not really a full character for him as the Duke in Total War, in the Warhammer tabletop. But, you know, there's enough there to translate. He could still hold the banner if the king let him into battle, despite the fact him being a Duke. He could have the horn. You could make a whole character around him. But that really is Armand of Aquitaine, and that's about it, really, for our Aquitaine video, guys. A bit of a shorter one, not one of the, let's say, historically pivotal dukedoms in Bretonnia, but a fun little dukedom with, you know, a nice beach, a very honourable duke who is doing his best to make the dukedom better, maybe try and get rid of some of those derelict hobos who are taking up empty places and murdering people in houses, but trying to do his best, and not like some of the other dukes who are just preoccupied with fighting. Kind of an all-rounder, really, is Armand of Aquitaine. So that's about it, guys. As always, a huge thank you for watching. As I said, if you want to see any of the videos I've referenced, do check the description below. But as always, guys, thanks for listening, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright, guys, bye.